Okay, I think we can start. We've given it a minute there. I can see lots of people joining. Okay, well, hello again to everyone in the audience and welcome to hopefully another great session as part of our webinar series in the EU Values Network. Just to introduce myself again, I'm Emily and your host and your moderator for this session. And today we have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Michael Zürn, a distinguished figure in the field of international relations and global governance. Michael is the director of the Department of Global Governance at the Social Science Research Center in Berlin, where he leads the research unit on global governance, focusing on the intricacies of international and transnational political processes. In addition to his numerous academic achievements, Michael is the co-author of an acclaimed book, The Democratic Regression, alongside Armin Schäfer. And this influential work has garnered significant attention and praise for its insightful analysis of the current challenges facing democracies worldwide. And we're very excited to hear more about this today. And we're also joined today by Dr. Adam Hollish, a postdoc fellow at eBay and the project manager of the EU Values Network. Adam will be our discussant, offering his valuable reflections on Michael's book. So before we begin, a few words about the EU Values Jean Monnet Network, in case you haven't heard of us before. We are a research and education network that unites 21 higher educational institutions from across Europe and the world. And we aim to enhance the debate and improve the knowledge of EU foreign policy. We're supported by the Erasmus Plus programme, and we encourage you to visit our website and sign up to our quarterly newsletter so you can get updates on our research, our blogs, webinars like this, podcasts and such. So sign up after this. And well, on behalf of the EU Values Network, thank you for joining. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Adam. And it's my great pleasure to hand over to you, Michael, if you'd like to share your screen and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emily, for this wonderful introduction. It's a good opportunity for me to be here. Is the screen sharing working?
Yes, if you can just press play in the top left-hand corner near the refresh. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so super, yeah. Okay, and I was asked to do a presentation, sort of a summary of the book that I wrote together with Armin Schäfer, The Democratic Regression, and I have labeled the presentation The Rise of Authoritarian Populist Parties, because that is essentially what we try to explain and what we try to understand in this book. Why is it that we have this rise of authoritarian populist parties in the last 20 or 30 years in almost all of the liberal democracies in Europe, but similarly in Latin America, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and some other places as well. And the point is that with the rise of those authoritarian populist parties, and especially if they get in power, if they are in government, that is paralleled by a decline in the number and the quality of democracies. I mean, this is the famous Wiedem data that shows, oh, this is still in German, sorry, that shows the number of democracies and the share of democracies of all states in the world since 1900 to 2020. And what we see essentially is, that after a very long rise in the number and in the share and the percentage of democracies from 1945 after World War II on, we see now a decline which is significant. I mean, it's not dramatic, but it's significant, and it's not much less steep than the decline, the earlier decline in the 1930s. And as we all know, the earlier decline in the 1930s was quite consequential. So, I mean, that is essentially the starting point after a long period of the rise of democracies, leading to the optimistic views of Fukuyama and many others that we live in an age of democracy, and democracy will diffuse further. And now we suddenly are confronted with a situation that we have a break in this development, and maybe the start of a new age, which means essentially the decline of democracy. The question is, of course, is why is this so? why do we have this decline in the number and percentage of democracies? And for this, I'm just starting out very generally, sort of abstractly, with the Milanovic elephant curve. And the Milanovic elephant curve essentially tries to capture the income growth of people in the world. It's not putting states here on the elephant curve, it's individuals in world society. And if you look to individuals in world society and their income growth between 1988 and 2008, we picked here the date 2008 because we consider this as a sort of a starting point of the wave of the rise of authoritarian populist parties. In those 20 years before, we see the acceleration in the rise of authoritarian populist parties. We see the following distribution of income growth. And first of all, let's briefly look at the two extreme points, which are, how shall I put it, the moral scandal of inequality, that the poorest people in the world, those with less than $1 per day income, mostly living in sub-Saharan Africa, there was no growth at all. On the other hand, if you look to the super rich, there's an enormous growth, and the growth is even faster since 2008. So while the richest, the super richest in the world get much, much richer in those 20 years, the poorest in the world do not have any significant income growth after inflation. But that is not our theme today. Our theme today are essentially two other dots here in this income distribution, which goes from the poorest to the richest and shows the rise in income. And what we see here are essentially 2 points. One is the highest point in the middle, in the center. And this strongest income growth in those 20 years took place in the middle class of world society, which is pretty much the same as the middle class in Eastern Asia and especially in China. What we essentially see here is an enormous rise in wealth, in income growth in countries like China. On the other hand, the only small decline that we see at the 80% point, that is essentially the middle class in the rich Western countries of the world. The well-established labor class working in big industrial firms, but also the lower middle class. It is the class which has not had any income growth in those 20 years. And that is now significant for two reasons. It on the one hand shows the success of authoritarian states. And it's the first time essentially since Industrial Revolution that authoritarian states have higher growth rates than liberal capitalist democracies. For a long time, for over 150 years, there was one thing that was a truism in world society, and that said and stated, if you want to have a decent life, if you want to consume, if you want to have that your kids have a better life chance and better life conditions than yourself, then move to liberal democracy. This Milanovic curve shows that there is a change and that this truism is not that true anymore. And on the other hand, it points to the frustration of many people living in liberal democracies that essentially see income growth all around them, but not for themselves. That is just the starting point of the whole story, why democracies do have a problem today. They have a problem because authoritarian states are now not only ideologically competitors, but are economically successful, and at the same time, their own middle class and lower middle class has economic problems, did not see any income growth for almost 20 years. And let me just say, if we look at this decline of democracy the first slide, then you can see here that it is very much the rise of authoritarian populist parties, which is responsible for the decline of democracies. It's not so much the rise of China, because in Sweden, China is one country that has not changed very much in terms of democratic quality the last 30 or 40 years. The driver for the decline in the quality of democracy and in the number of democracies are the rise of populist authoritarianism. And that means essentially, if authoritarian populist parties can come into power and are able to transform the regime of a liberal democracy to a populist authoritarian state. And that was tried in places like Brazil, in places like the US, in Poland, and it was successful in some other places like Hungary, Russia, Venezuela, probably also Turkey. And in all of those places, you see the black dots are those when the populist authoritarians were in power. In those days, the quality of democracy went down. So the driver for the decline in the quality of democracy is the rise of populist authoritarian governments. That, of course, leads now to the second question, and that is the question, what is it when we talk about authoritarian populist parties or populist authoritarian regimes? There's a certain understanding that essentially says this is a very thin ideology. It only juxtaposes the pure people with the corrupt elite, and everything else is open. Armin and myself, we argue in this book that it is a bit broader, and it has elements of an ideology which is especially clear as juxtaposition to their counterpart, that is essentially the new leftist parties, the Green parties. And the characteristics of those authoritarian populist parties can be captured in 4 points. The first is they are anti-pluralist. They not only talk about the simple people, the majority, the silent majority. They also have an understanding of the people of a country which is based on a very homogeneous concept of the people. It's not a pluralist concept, it's an anti-pluralist concept, which is very often, not always, but very often ethnically based. Even in the US, I mean, sort of a nation that was never ethnically based, but here it is now very much an understanding of the white people who belong to the silent majority. So that is one characteristic, anti-pluralism. A second characteristic is nationalism, a very strict understanding that political communities end at national borders. There is no role for regional integration, for international institutions, for any sort of transnational configuration in this ideology of the authoritarian populists. If there is one thing that is in common of all of the authoritarian populist parties, it's probably not anti-migration. I mean, Erdogan in Turkey is relatively open to migration. If there is one thing that is in common, it's the rejection of international institutions and the EU. It is essentially a major enemy of all of those authoritarian populist parties. In that sense, it's nationalist, and the slogan America First puts this forward in a very, very clear way. A third element of this ideology is what one may label decisionism. And it is, yes, there's a certain way of thinking the majority should have the say, and that is, of course, at first sight, a sort of a democratic understanding. But then again, the idea is this majority does not have to express its will. The will is known by the populist leaders. Heinz Strache in Austria, once a leader of the FPÖ, had election posters stating, he knows what we want. And that is very much this, he knows what we want, is very much the basic understanding of of the political process of those populist parties. There is no need for deliberation. There is no need for parliamentary debates or parliamentary negotiations. This is all nonsense. Essentially, the need is to translate the will of the people in clear decisions, and this will be done by strong leaders. Therefore, decisionist. And finally, it's, as I mentioned already, majority fixated. The will of the majority must be implemented, even if it is violating minority rights and individual rights. So those four components, anti-pluralist, nationalist, decisionist, and majority fixated, are the major characteristics of authoritarian populism, and they work in a sense as an ideology, at least as a counter ideology to the liberal cosmopolitan elite, which is, according to the view of the authoritarian populists dominating liberal countries, which are very much in favor of international institutions, which are very much in favor of globalization, which are in favor of migration, and have therefore a strongly pluralist understanding of the society, and which focus on deliberation and all those talking and so on. In that sense, it's a clear counterpole to the new left, to the Green parties. That is the ideological core of authoritarian populism. And now there are many, certainly Armin's in my book is not the first one that tries to give an explanatory account of authoritarian populism, but we are essentially making an argument that we should look much more on the political side and not so much on the economic side and the cultural side that is emphasized by some of those theories of authoritarian populism. I mean, there's, of course, the argument that we all know, it is growing inequality that is leading to the rise of authoritarian populist parties. There is some truth in it, but as we know from most of the studies, the effect is not very strong. And we also see the rise of authoritarian populist parties in countries that have much less inequality, like Sweden. We see it in countries that have been economically successful, like Austria and Turkey. So, I mean, the economic side cannot explain it fully, at least. And the same is true for the Norris-Engelhardt backlash argument, which essentially states, well, liberal democracies have liberalized too quickly. There are too strong and quick movements towards rights for non-discrimination movements, and therefore there's a sort of a backlash. According to this view, it should be temporary and should be not that strong. It becomes ever stronger. And it also does not explain why this cultural explanation, why those countries are so much against international institutions. And it also does not explain why we have strong authoritarian populist movements in countries like Poland and Hungary, where we certainly did not see a lot of LGBT plus liberalization. So we are focusing on a political explanation, and the political explanation takes us a sort of a starting point. The famous Robert Dahl, not Ronald, Robert Dahl, and he stated already in 1965, and I read this now just for a second, the politics of compromise, adjustment, negotiation, bargaining, a politics carried on among professional and quasi-professional leaders who constitute only a small part of the total citizen body. A politics that reflects a commitment to the virtues of pragmatism, moderation, and incremental change. A politics that is unideological and even anti-ideological. Many citizens see this form of politics as too remote and bureaucratized, too addicted to bargaining and compromise, and too much an instrument of political elite and technocrats. This is an explanation by Robert Dahl. He did not write a program of the authoritarian populist parties, but it is an explanation already given in 1965 what the sort of moderation in the liberal democracies that essentially took place from the 1960s on would have what kind of effect this would have in the long term. And our argument is he was right. We need to have a political explanation to understand the rise of authoritarian populist parties. And that consists essentially of two elements. One is a problem of representation. That is the point that Armin emphasizes very strongly. And I put it in very simple terms now for a moment, that while in the 1950s, 1960s, or to put it differently, Eric Schatzsnyder was always right, of course, when he wrote in the 1960s that all the parliaments in the world are singing with an upper class accent. This has been true in the 1960s, and this is true today. There's a difference, however. In the 1960s, the people who saw themselves as the lower classes, as the lower strata in society, they had a party that they considered as a party representing them. And that were essentially the social democratic or the socialist parties. Nowadays, in the days of globalization and in the days of the globalization losers, which are often those people who are not very well educated, do not have a party that represents them in the party. And that leads to a situation that, according to this data of Armin and his colleagues, it is essentially the parliament essentially never decides in favor of the lower class if the measure is not at the same time supported by the upper classes and by the middle classes. So there's, first of all, a representation problem in the parliaments, and secondly, this representation problem translates in decisions in favor or against workers and against the lower classes in society. That is the representation problem. And the argument is that became stronger over time. And in that sense, people increasingly feel alienated from liberal democracy. The second part of the argument is that also from the 1960s on, we see an enormous rise of something that can be labeled non-majoritarian institutions. And non-majoritarian institutions are both in this conceptualization. On the national level, it's essentially central banks, it's Supreme Courts, it's regulatory agencies in the US, all those bodies who make decisions not necessarily based on people who were elected into this position to make the position as the parliament, but they are elected or they were nominated into this position on the basis of their epistemic expertise. And in a sense, the same is true for international organizations. International organizations, regional international organizations like the EU, but also global ones became stronger and stronger in the last 50 years. Here we see essentially that this is a very clear-cut development essentially taking place in all countries, that we see a rise of non-majoritarian institutions, a rise of importance of non-majoritarian institutions in making decisions. And that, of course, leads to a situation that the decisions of the parliaments are getting less important. And in that sense, Churchill's statement, democracy is when the small man in the small cabin makes a small cross, that this is essentially, that this cross in the cabin is losing importance. It's becoming less important who is in the parliament, it's becoming more important who runs those non-majoritarian institutions. And those non-majoritarian institutions are also not deciding impartially. They essentially are for the liberal cosmopolitans. They are for open borders. They are for strong international institutions, and they are for individual rights. You can see here only very briefly that the parliament, this is the dot on the very left side, is somehow in the middle on this pole between cosmopolitan and communitarian positions. But all the non-majoritarian institutions, they are clearly on the cosmopolitan side in the positions that they take. So there's a bias in those non-majoritarian institutions in favor of the cosmopolitan liberal elites and against the silent communitarian majority. So this is our argument, and I just summarize it now essentially by saying it's not the policies, it's not the economic and the cultural policies that are to blame for the rise for the authoritarian populists. It is the political system. The narrative of the authoritarian populists grasps and targets something that resonates very well with the perception of the people. And the narrative says there's a political class that negotiates among selves, that is working essentially in order to maintain their position and their wealth. There's a lying press, there are system parties. All those things refer essentially to the politics side of a political system. If you look at the programs of the PEN, of the AfD, and some of those other authoritarian populist parties, well, they differ not that much from the mainstream parties, especially if you look to economic policies. There are some cultural policies. Gender equality is something that they sometimes target. And of course, the major exception is migration. But besides those two issues, they sound very, very mainstream when it comes to policies. They are not mainstream when it comes to politics, when it comes to the characterization of the political class capture of the political system captured by a political class, which essentially does not listen to the people. And in order just to show that this is the perception of the people, I use at the end the Pew survey. There was the question, do you think the elected officials in your country care what people like you think? And the numbers are shockingly low. It's around 30% in Great Britain and Germany. It's even lower in France. This is really a shocking number. I mean, if essentially 70% of the people in all of those three countries agree that the elected officials don't care about people like us, that is a shocking number. And it's a very high number. We are talking here about roughly 70%. If you look to the major candidates of the policy explanations, backlash of the old white man, the goal of gender equality has enormously high approval ratings, 90% in Germany and France, 92% in Great Britain. So, I mean, that seems to be, that cannot explain why 30–40% of the people vote for authoritarian populist parties. And in a sense, the same is true for economic uncertainty. At least when this survey was done, that was before the pandemic, there was a predominantly positive assessment of the individual economic situation. Between 53% and 64% of the people thought that they have improved their situation in the last 20 years and have a positive assessment of their economic situation. This is much higher than immediately after 1990, where the numbers were much lower. So also the economic explanation is not really taking the way people think. It is very much this political system issue, the sense, the feeling there's a political class that is not working for us. And in the book we have this graph, with which I want to end, that there's a very strong and a clear-cut relationship on the one hand between those people who think that people can not influence politics and the votes share of populist parties, and that this also is very much structured in along social classes, among social milieus. So especially the more working manually working groups that are very much affected by globalization, they believe that politics, that people cannot influence politics, and they vote essentially very often for populist parties. And the more you move up to the more intellectual working people, there the correlation becomes much weaker. So our argument, just to summarize it in that way, is it is the alienation from the way democracy works that leads essentially to the rise of authoritarian populist parties. And in that sense, even if they know that those parties will endanger liberal democracy, they still vote for them. I mean, you just have to look to the US in order to see this. There was a president who was essentially trying to question the outcome of an election, and he nevertheless seems to win the election 4 years later, in spite of the fact that all the people knows, well, he doesn't care about democracy. And the reason is because people are very much alienated from liberal democracy as the way they perceive it. And in that sense, in order to understand authoritarian populism, but also in order to fight authoritarian populism, we probably have to think much more about the politics side, about the way democracy works and the way how we can reform and transform democracy, then focus on some specific small policies which often do not change very much. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for these insightful kind of discussion around your key arguments with your book. We will now turn to Adam for your reflections on the book as well. And just to remind the audience today that we have the option of a Q&A. There is a box at the bottom of the screen that you can write your questions in, and we'll come to that towards the end. All right, over to you, Adam. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily. Thank you very, very much, Michel. It is a very thought-provoking book. I have to admit, I just read it in one day. It was a very easy read. It's very important. And at the same time, it's based on a very solid empirical basis, right? Why do I think it's based on a very solid empirical basis? Because every argument starts with questions or assumptions about democracy, which were introduced already by the classical works of political science, right? And then with Armin, you test it with empirical evidence of the most important sources there is in democracy research, like Varieties of Democracy, the Chapel Hill expert survey, the populist data set, right? Besides that, you put most of the stuff which came out in the last years, which is very interesting, for example, like the elephant curve of Milanovic, right? So it's therefore, it's very easy to digest, making it a book also for non-academic public. And I think this is very important, no? Because this is also one of the main takeaways of your book, right? This political explanation, no? But I will come back a little bit later to that. Then why is it timely and refreshing? Now you relate, at the beginning of the book, you relate to Samuel Huntington's work on the wave of democratization, right? And you position these developments in the third reverse wave of democratization. No, however, no, and this many scholars do that. However, you are very skeptical about a possible fourth wave of democratization, right? And you argue that most of the factors which allowed for these three first waves are not longer given, right? They were given only during the unique context after 1945. And because you argue from the beginning, but you are very skeptical about the fourth wave of democratization. Now, I think this allows you for a different type of analysis. Now, because there are many articles, books, which say, yeah, this is something exceptional, this will go away. Now, and you mentioned it also in your book. Therefore, and this gives place, right, for some parts of your book which are very provocative, which I really like, right? So academics, or also some popular books on populism, no, explain this third reverse way, focusing on two things, right? First, they complain about these non-informed voters, sometimes calling them stupid, right, and their bad decisions. Or they look at the populist parties, no, and look at this charlatan rhetorics, how they want to treat people into voting them, right? And your approach is very different, and therefore so important, right? You focus mainly, and I think this was very clear in your presentation, on the flows of liberal democracy, now focusing on this political dimension, right? On the political explanation based on these two dynamics. One, that many voters, mainly of the working class, right, feel not anymore represented. Here you now, for example, you use the work of the Diploma Democracy by Wons and Wille. Now showing, for example, that most of the members of parliament are academics, right? And therefore the academics are overrepresented, the working class, for example, is not represented. However, this is only one step, no? And as you showed also in your presentation, due to the globalization dynamics, most of the decisions right now are taken by the non-majoritarian organizations, right? Which take power of these elected parliaments, which already had the problem now, which goes, they were already biased towards, right, the higher middle class, or maybe now the upper class, right? And I think one of the most important contributions of the book is that this political explanation has to be included in future analysis, right? It's not only the economic or the cultural, right? There are authors claiming the one side or the other, but I think it has to be in future analysis, it has to be included now, because due to these factors, the voters look now how to cast their votes into these new parties, these authoritarian populists. Then your stand on populists is also very interesting, right? There is this tendency to use it as a thin ideology, how also you mentioned it many times in the book, now based on Kasmude's work. However, now you say this is a little bit more. This is more based on 4 distinctive features, that political communities end at national borders, is therefore authoritarian populist is nationalistic, but authoritarian populists work with the image of people as homogeneous, right? And the third point, I think, is very important. But the political attitudes, interests are given and not a consequence of a discussion of the leader and the people. And I think this in the analysis of populists, which I read until now, this was somehow missing. Now you say it very clearly. Now it's not about the people, it's about the leader who said to the people what they have to think. No? And the fourth point, it's that the will of majority must be implemented, and therefore it's fixed. Now this authoritarian populism is fixated on the majority. And a very nice example which you give now is, for example, this Yellow Vest movement in France, this protest movement, which unified authoritarian populists from both sides, Rassemblement National and La France Insoumise, the Luc Mélenchon, right? And I think this is very good. Then you were not talking in your presentation, therefore I will mention it, because your book also focuses a lot on solutions. Your solutions are very innovative. No? Let me mention these 10 solutions, and because they are really new in some aspects, right? So the 10 solutions how to deal with authoritarian populists is withstand technocratic temptations, trust the citizens, dismantle the context of inequality, avoid false reforms, church party recruitment models, more public oversight of non-majoritarian institutions, democratizing the European Union, learning from Switzerland and its federal system, then cosmopolitan passion. Here you say that it should be the arguments in favor of cosmopolitanism should be better, and then encourage tolerance for ambiguity, complexity, arguing that democracy is complex and we should tell it to the voters, right? I like in particular the suggestion, right? But besides quotes for female representation, we also might need representation for other professional groups, because this is very clear in your book also that this is a negative development in the last decades. Before that, we had politicians from all professional groups, and right now there are some parties, right, which say we only take academics, right? We don't put in the parliament people which are not academics. And I think this is very clear in your book that this is it's not a good thing. And also, point 5 is related, change party recruitment models. Now that parties should change the selections of the candidates and be more open to include other groups. So one thing maybe, which my first question is, now you focus and you show very clearly that when the populists are in power, this is a threat of the democracy. However, what happens if the populists deliver? Well, because maybe they will not deliver in the protection of democracy, but maybe they were not elected because they had to protect democracy, but not because there were some other problems within the system. For example, welfare state. The welfare state can be seen not as something economic, but also something political. And for example, when we look at Poland and the peace government under Kaczynski, now what they did in the first year, it was introduce the child support, which, for example, in Western Europe is considered some part of a welfare state. So they delivered and then the state to power. So that would be the first question. How do you, there may be some ideas for another book. How would you deal with this question? Then I have 3 more questions, and they have more to do with the recent developments, right? So one, in chapter 5, for example, you explain the different crises of democracy and how they influence this cleavage between authoritarian populists and liberal globalists. Now, we definitely have right now a new critical juncture with the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And would you qualify as such a crisis? And if so, how does it influence this new cleavage? Then I would have another question about the French elections, right, which were very salient in the last 2 weeks. Do you see with this the confirmation of this new cleavage in the recent French elections? How would you evaluate the results? And then one thing which is very present in the book is the first presidency of Donald Trump, right? It's a very important factor. And here already, but that's a very speculative question. What would you expect from his possible second term? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Adam. And well, Michael, feel free to respond to those questions or any other reflections you have. Sounds like we're going to have to book you in for another webinar around the solutions as well. It's a very interesting point made. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I mean, first of all, thank you, Adam, for the nice additional description and some of the applause for that, but also for those very challenging questions. I mean, first question, what happens if the authoritarian populists deliver? The thing is, and I think the example of Poland shows that to some extent, I'm going to repeat the argument. It's maybe policies are not that much important. I mean, if you see a case like Poland, where essentially they deliver to some extent, but nevertheless, they were not re-elected. And in some other places in the world, the authoritarian populists were not very successful, but were almost re-elected. So that repeats to some extent that it is not very so much the policies and the success of policies and their success, which is decisive, but whether they are able to convey the message that they will represent the interest of the will much better than others. I mean, to some extent, if you look at the first administration of Trump, yes, it was a time of growth. In that sense, he delivered. But then, I mean, regarding Corona policies and some other things, he obviously failed with his administration and very much related to his ideology. And nevertheless, the punishment of the government for these failed policies was not very extensive. The whole decision, do I go for the Trumpites or go I for the Democratic Party, is much less influenced by political positions on specific policies than we essentially have believed how it should be in liberal democracies. It's much more driven by this sort of symbolic issue. Do you act in the name of the elite, or do you act in the name of the majority? In that sense, sometimes authoritarian populists deliver, but that does not guarantee their success. Sometimes they fail, but that does not guarantee their failure. That would be the response, essentially. That would be the response to this first question. Second, Ukraine. Of course, a very interesting case. Very interesting because, on the one hand, I think it is the strongest proof for new cleavage theory that you can get. At least in my country, in Germany, I mean, I see almost the same coalitions in favor of a strong support for Ukraine versus those saying, oh, well, let's create a sort of a freedom, and even sometimes relatively frank and open support for Putin. It's very much the same coalitions than we had in those other crises. like the Corona crisis or the financial crisis. It's again globalization winners versus the globalization losers. It is the same sort of ideologies that stand behind those different positions. And in that sense, a theme that has very, at least at first sight, very, very little to do with the core of the cleavage, which is globalization winners versus globalization losers, reproduces the same political factions and coalitions than the other crises. I mean, that seems to be a relatively strong sign that this cleavage is now very consequential and very strong in liberal democracies. At the same time, it is different. It is different from the other crises. It's different for, especially now in terms of the argument of our book, especially in terms of the argument that those crises, all of those crises, essentially make these developments away from the traditional democracy, make the alienation from democracy, from liberal democracy, much more visible, because those earlier crises, like the financial crisis or the Corona crisis, they were moments when it became so obvious how important the experts are, and how important the non-majoritarian institutions are, and how little important the parliaments are. I mean, in the financial crisis, the parliaments played for a long time no role. The same is true for the Corona crisis. They came in very, very late. The whole process was dominated for a long time by the experts. And in Germany, one could say, I mean, the two names that are probably most famous in those two crises, both start with D, are two representatives of those experts in non-majoritarian institutions. Draghi for the financial crisis, and the virologist Drosten on the other side. So in that sense, I mean, those crises essentially made the sort of development that was going on in the democracy very, very much visible. In that sense, essentially strengthened the development and strengthened the sense of alienation from democracy. This is somewhat different in the Ukraine crisis, because, I mean, the Ukraine crisis is, of course, also a crisis that leads to a certain empowerment of the executive, but there the experts do not play such a decisive role. The parliament was very early involved in the decisions of supporting or not supporting Ukraine. So in that sense, it is different. It is similar that it produces the same political coalitions, but it is different in the sense that it does not produce to the same extent the empowerment of experts than the other crises that we had in the last 10 or 15 years. So in that sense, the long-term effect of the Ukraine crisis, maybe, sometimes I'm still an optimist, maybe even positive for liberal democracies, because it has essentially strengthened democratic debate. It has strengthened parliaments. It has strengthened the sort of debates within political debates within national political systems. Yeah, I mean, regarding the French election, again, two sides. On the one hand, of course, very clear support for the cleavage thesis. I mean, essentially after the outcome of the first round, there was a decision by all of the mainstream parties, which are mainly on the other side of the cleavage, that we want to prevent Le Pen at any price. And therefore, there was this coalition leading to this somewhat surprising result in the second round. So, I mean, that is fully in line with the cleavage, that it is by now essentially structuring political action, because it is this cleavage that brought essentially Macron, the Republicans, the socialist parties, and the Greens together. And otherwise, they would have not worked together. However, there's, of course, one exception, and you realized it already from the list of actors. I didn't mention Mélenchon. I didn't mention the Islamo-Moise movement. And in that sense, of course, the cleavage is still, to some extent, conflated with the old left-right, or this dimension of the two-dimensional space still gets to some extent conflated with the old cleavage between left and right, because Mélenchon, in a sense, did not coalesce with the movement to which he is probably in many respects closer than with Macron, but with all the other leftist parties in order to prevent the victory of a rightist parties. In that sense, the coalition that was really put together still had an element of old rightist versus leftist politics, and it tells you that, of course, the old cleavage between left and right still has structural power in the political organization of liberal democracies as well, but probably in this case the new cleavage between, let's say, the cosmopolitan liberals and the authoritarian populists was stronger.
Great, thank you very much for that. We have a few really great questions to put to both of you, actually, but do feel free to jump in. So we have one from Tony. Could there be an influence of religious ideology or lack of it thereof at work and influencing populist authoritarianism? For example, the rise of militant Islamism or Christian fundamentalism?
That's an extremely good question, and I think also a completely under-researched question. And I think the direction is not very clear. I mean, if you look to the rise of fascism in the 1930s, and there are some structural similarities with the rise of authoritarian populists today. I mean, there was a very strongly established argument, a very strong argument that it was, especially in Catholic circles, which traditionally voted conservative, where the fascists had most problems to be successful. So in that sense, a strong religious belief, especially with the Catholic Church, which was at that time not at all a democratic force, but nevertheless the Catholic and also Protestant beliefs essentially helped to protect against the ideology from the fascists. And I think this still holds true to some extent. If you look to Poland, I think the influence of the Catholic Church is overall still more on the side of the liberals than on the side of this. So that's one side. But then on the other side is, of course, that the evangelicals are clearly part of the Trump movement, are part of the authoritarian populist movement in the US. And I think the whole basic idea of the evangelicals, the extreme subjectivity in approaching religion, that this extreme subjectivity, of course, plays a role in anti-corona movements and climate-denying movements and so on. So, I mean, this element of religion, the radical Protestant evangelical subjective side of religion, which was at least for a long time rather seen on the progressive side of society, is now much more much closer to the authoritarian populists, much more vulnerable to the arguments of the authoritarian populists, while probably the Catholic Church is still a sort of a protection belt for and tends to be associated with the vote for Democratic parties.
Okay, so the second question was from Zürn. Is it possible or desirable to eradicate populism at all? It seems that populism emerges as a consequence of the fact that some communities feel that they are not represented properly at the global forum. Will more democracy actually lead to the radicalization of some communities that clearly do not want to be integrated into liberalized democratic frameworks?
Of course, we don't know in the end. I mean, the argument is, here at this point, the rejection of international institutions as an element of non-majoritarian institutions may have some good reasons, and that is that they are not democratic institutions. I mean, we cannot argue that the United Nations Security Council is a democratic institution, and even the EU, which is probably the most democratic international institution, is still not a liberal democracy. In that sense, it is true that decisions are taken, important decisions are taken by institutions that are not democratic, and where especially the people who do not speak English, the people who do not travel a lot, the people who work at home, the people who have a strong connection to the home country and so on, they feel essentially dominated by these international institutions. They don't know how they can influence these decisions, and they have the feeling the EU does what they want, and they do not listen to them. But of course, as a cosmopolitan liberal, as someone who is working on international institutions, I believe that these institutions are absolutely necessary in spite of this deficit, in spite of this problem. I don't see how we can solve the problems of our world and of our days without those institutions. I mean, we need some international coordination and some strong international institutions to combat climate change. I think if we want to save in the long term, the finances of the Western welfare states, we need to find strong international regulation to tax digital companies on the global level and stuff like that. I mean, there are so many issues that we can only tackle on the international level. So if that is the situation, that they are not democratic, but we need them, and if the choice essentially is to say, well, either we get rid of them or we strengthen authoritarian populist forces, then I would say there's a third way, and that way is essentially to democratize those institutions. I mean, that's, of course, not a 2 years project. That's a century project, what we are talking about. But I mean, those democratization was always a process that took centuries. It's nothing that happens from today to tomorrow. But in that sense, if there's a growing understanding that those international institutions do not work against the people, but for the people, and have some mechanisms that bring in the voice of the people, that may essentially lead to a situation that people are less skeptical about those international institutions.
Thank you. We have one here from Walter. Why are many of these authoritarian movements based on inaccurate facts, or even facts they conveniently create themselves and that appear immune to correction? I mean,
if you would rewrite the book, I probably would argue there's a fifth feature of those authoritarian populist arguments, and that is a sort of a special epistemology, a special social epistemology, which challenges some of the basic beliefs about liberal social epistemology, and that part of it is, of course, truth orientation. It is essentially the acceptance of certain processes, how to assess truth, and then not essentially just say, but I believe something else, and what I believe is right. So there's the acceptance of a certain role of science, a privileged role of science in assessing what society's belief is right or wrong, and is true or untrue. In that sense, I mean, there's a sort of epistemological side of authoritarian populist bodies, which is part of the ideology. This is a very important part. To be honest, I'm currently working on this. I'm trying to identify what is actually, how does the liberal truth regime work, and what essentially are the strategies of the authoritarian populists to undermine the liberal truth regime. So I would fully agree with the question, if one can agree with a question, that this is a very fundamental problem, and it's probably part of the whole package, that it is part of the package as much as anti-pluralism and decisionism, etc. is it.
Great. And we have time for just one more, I think, as it's 4 o'clock now. So one from Alexander here. I'm wondering about the other side of the equation. What agencies exist for authoritarian populist leaders? Many of these parties have detoxified in the last 20 years, but how do we understand their ability to shape and capture sections of the electorate?
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure if the assumption that they have detoxified. I mean, maybe they have pluralized to some extent internally, but most of those parties have a very strong and even clearly radicalized right-wing element within them. The AfD in Germany, it's true for, I think, all the Scandinavian parties. Probably the exception is Le Pen, but there essentially we have a party which is very strongly dominated by the leader, and the leader has decided that we have more moderate rhetoric in order to win elections. But I'm still sure that part of the movements is very much on the extreme. They don't get a voice to the same extent as in other authoritarian populist parties because of the enormous strength of Le Pen in this movement. So I'm not sure whether it is true. I think the assumption of the question is probably right, that they became more plural in the sense that there are some moderate forces as well. How can we prevent the success of those parties? I mean, this is the $100,000 question, I guess, in the end. And Adam has mentioned some of the proposals that we have, but keep in mind, none of those proposals that you put forward is in any way working from one year to another. I mean, it's all structural proposals, how to change essentially society and some processes in the society in order to reduce the background conditions and make the background conditions weaker that allowed the rise of those parties.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. I'm sure the audience here today enjoyed it as much as I did. And just to say that we'll be uploading it to YouTube in the coming days, should anyone want to rewatch any parts as well. But yeah, on behalf of EU Values, thank you so much, Michael, and also Adam.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Thanks.